Okay, we're going to look at seizures now. Now, everybody, when you say seizures, immediately thinks epilepsy, which is the #1 cause for recurrent seizures. People that have lots of seizures, generally people believe that is epilepsy. However, there's a big word of warning here. I use the mnemonic ABC, which is assume nothing, believe no one, check everything. You don't assume it's epilepsy that's causing that seizure. There are quite a number of medical conditions that can bring about a seizure. In children, you get febrile convulsions. When they overheat, they end up having a seizure, which is a medical emergency, and it's got nothing to do with epilepsy. The only similarity with all the seizures is it's generally to do with the brain, an electrical storm in the brain, which can be triggered by lack of oxygen. Now, we haven't talked about it yet, but there's a thing called a cardiac arrest, where somebody goes into cardiac arrest, the heart stops pumping blood, which therefore stops circulating oxygen around the body. As soon as somebody suffers from a cardiac arrest, it does happen sometimes where people go into a seizure, okay? So you could be looking at somebody having a seizure thinking they're having an epileptic episode, and actually they're in the process of a cardiac arrest, which basically means they're in the process of dying. So it's very important, don't assume it's epilepsy, okay? Other things, causes for seizures, could be a brain tumour, it could be drug-induced, alcohol-induced, it could be to do with the temperature. So something I'm going to cover on PowerPoint in a later presentation is on heat strokes. And heat strokes, one of the symptoms of a heat stroke is a seizure. But that's pretty advanced. When they have the seizure, they're on the way out. So yeah, again, you need to not assume that it's epilepsy. How would we know it's epileptic? We'd ask bystanders, does anybody know this person? Okay. If they do, they might be able to say, yes, they do suffer from epilepsy. But again, we're not going to assume. Part of a survey, secondary survey that we might do is to search the person's body for other information whilst they're having a seizure. And that could be bracelets, SOS talismans, and it could say epilepsy. They could have medication on them that indicates that. They could have information on their phone. Most people have medical alerts on their phones where you don't need the PIN code, you can access it by pressing the on button, which then normally prompts you for the passcode, but it also says medical at the bottom, and that means you can either make a 999 call from that phone or see their medical history if they've inputted that on their health app on their phone. That applies to Apple and Android. What does a seizure look like? Basically, it can be two types of seizures. It can be what they call a petit mal seizure, which is basically where they go into sort of like an absence, a bit like when I've been to these management meetings and you're sitting there and it feels like you're on a different planet. It might look like that, and when I occasionally see people daydreaming, I'll actually say, are you okay? And then when they respond straight away, I know that's not a seizure. When they don't respond, that can actually be quite dangerous depending on what they're actually doing at the time. They could be driving a car or otherwise, and that's why people that have had seizures are not allowed to drive cars for up to 6 months until they've been given the all clear, and that's the reason why. So it could be that. The other type of seizure is a major seizure, grand mal seizure, and that's the one that everybody identifies with epilepsy and other types of medical conditions. So, and that could include, as I said, brain tumours, head injuries, drug-induced, could be epilepsy, it could be cardiac arrest. So there's lots of things it might, including a stroke as well, because that affects the brain. So I'm going to ask Martin to demonstrate what a seizure looks like. Where you go, Martin. Okay, so his whole body has gone into spasm. Now he's on a mat at the moment, but if that mat wasn't there, the big danger for him would be his head. So you can relax for a second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to support his head. Okay. So when he's having the seizure, I don't need to worry about his airway per se. But if you go back into the seizure now, so when he's having the seizure, all I'm going to do is just support his head. Now I could put a jacket or a t-shirt. So here's my t-shirt. Just shove that underneath the actual head, just to support his head. So if he was on this floor, that would cause problems. So just lift his head up, okay, and let him have the seizure. I don't try and restrain him. Protect the head. The other important thing I must do is check what time. Now, provided I've seen what time the seizure started, I time it. If he's got epilepsy, generally epileptic seizures last 2 to 3 minutes. Anything that lasts longer than 5 minutes call an ambulance, even if they suffer from epilepsy, because that is not normal, okay? If it's the first seizure they've ever had, call an ambulance. That is a medical emergency. If you don't know this person and they have a seizure, call an ambulance. If they subsequently come around after their seizure, because they generally come out of the seizure quite quickly, and they say, I've got epilepsy, I have them all the time, then I've got the option to cancel the ambulance. Easy peasy. But don't assume, unless you know and somebody says, I know them, they've got epilepsy, then you treat it as a medical emergency, okay? So if you're not sure, call an ambulance. You've always got the option to cancel the ambulance if need be. But if it's the first seizure, always call an ambulance, because it's not necessarily epilepsy. It could be any one of those other things that's going on. If they don't make a significant recovery after a couple of minutes, then call an ambulance. 5 minutes is the key number. If they have multiple seizures, so if he has a seizure, cue the seizure, he then stops, and then he starts again, that's not normal. So in that occasion, call an ambulance, okay? But very important, check the time. Now, if I walked into this room and Martin was already having a seizure, I don't know what time it started, I'm calling an ambulance, okay? So unless you can confirm what time the seizure started and make a note of it, because when the ambulance arrives, you can say, how long have they been having a seizure for? About 10 minutes. That's not normal. So that's really helpful information for an ambulance crew. Okay, so he has his seizure. He's now come out of the seizure. A couple of things you need to be aware of with a seizure. Check him for any other injuries, because when they have seizures, quite often people just go straight down, a bit like fainting, and he may have bitten into his tongue, bitten his lip. Obviously, if he's unresponsive and he's breathing, I'm going to put him in the recovery position. If he's responsive and breathing and he's managing his airway, not a problem, but he might feel a little bit nauseous. Very common with people having full-blown epileptic seizures is they mess themselves. So he may have wet himself, or even worse than that, done a number 2. So if he did or has, get a blanket or get the old silver blanket out the first aid kit and just cover their lower half, just to give them a little bit of dignity, and move people away, because it is embarrassing for people that have messed themselves. They've got no control over that, but it does happen. Be aware that if somebody goes into a seizure, they can still hear you initially. So be aware of what you say and what other people say in the presence of that person. And the first sentence that comes back after seizure is their hearing. So again, be aware what people are saying around that casualty, because some people try and do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, like restrain them. You don't restrain them. And very, very important point, you don't put anything in their mouth. People have got this old mother's wives' tale idea that you put a wooden spoon in their mouth to stop them biting the tongue. We've all bitten our tongue at some stage. It will sort itself out. That's not a danger to the casualty, but a wooden spoon in the mouth is, because if they break the teeth or break the spoon, it can become a choking hazard. So don't put anything in the mouth, and certainly do not put your fingers in the mouth, because they will literally bite at anything that goes in their mouth. Okay, so don't put your fingers in their mouth. Just monitor their situation. Check them out for any other injuries they may have sustained falling to the floor or during the seizure itself. If they're in a position where you can't make them safe, drag them to a place where it is safe for them. So if they're at the top of a flight of stairs or in the middle of a lift closing on their head, move them out of the way, drag them out of the way from the hip. Even if they're having a seizure, just drag them out of the way, get them in a safe position, and then carry on, monitoring them and making sure they're okay. And as they start to come around, lots and lots of reassurance.